In 1969, covering a bounced check was a rare courtesy that banks extended to their best customers. By 2019, that courtesy had become a $12 billion annual gold mine, and the people paying weren't wealthy clients anymore. They were the most financially vulnerable Americans, hit with fees that can carry an effective annual interest rate of 17,000%. This is how hidden charges turned America's banks into profit machines. Picture this. You buy a $5 coffee with your debit card, not knowing your account is a few dollars short. That innocent purchase triggers a $35 overdraft fee, turning your morning caffeine fix into a $40 transaction overnight. This isn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect of banking. It's a carefully engineered profit system that generates more revenue for some banks than entire business divisions. The story begins in 1968 when Congress passed the Truth in Lending Act to protect consumers from predatory lending. The following year, in 1969, the Federal Reserve created what seemed like a harmless exemption. Banks could honor the occasional bounced check without following strict lending rules, treating it as a courtesy service rather than a loan. Back then, this actually made sense. Families relied on mail to send checks, processing times were unpredictable, and overdrafts were genuinely rare, inadvertent events. But banks saw an opportunity hiding in plain sight. In the 1990s, as debit cards revolutionized how Americans spent money, banks quietly transformed this customer courtesy into an automated profit engine. They began offering overdraft protection as a convenient service. For a fee, they would cover your overdrawn transactions instead of letting them bounce. What they did not emphasize was just how profitable this convenience would become. The explosion of debit card usage changed everything. Unlike checks, which took days to process and gave customers time to realize their mistake, debit card transactions happened instantly. Suddenly, Americans were making multiple small purchases throughout the day: coffee, lunch, gas, groceries, each one a potential overdraft trigger. Banks realized they could generate multiple $35 fees from a single day's spending spree. The numbers reveal the true scope of this operation. In 2019, banks with assets over $1 billion collected $12.6 billion in overdraft and insufficient funds fees. To put that in perspective, that is more than many Fortune 500 companies earn in total revenue. JP Chase alone made over $1 billion from overdraft fees in 2024, while Wells Fargo matched that figure. Even without these fees, these institutions would have earned $51.5 billion and $21.6 billion respectively, proving that overdraft revenue was not about covering costs, but pure profit. The math behind individual transactions exposes the predatory nature of these fees. When someone borrows $24 through an overdraft for just 3 days and pays a $34 fee, that loan carries an astronomical 17,000% annual percentage rate. No payday lender or credit card company could legally charge such rates, yet banks do it millions of times daily under the guise of customer service. But here's the most disturbing aspect. The burden isn't distributed equally. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau data shows that just 8% of customers pay 75% of all overdraft fees. These aren't wealthy Americans making careless mistakes. They're financially struggling individuals who overdraft more than 10 times per year, often because they're living paycheck to paycheck. Black households are more than twice as likely to pay overdraft fees compared to white households, with 31% incurring these charges compared to 14% of white families. Banks did not just passively collect these fees, they actively manipulated the system to maximize profits. Internal documents revealed that many banks engaged in transaction reordering, processing the largest purchases first to drain accounts faster and trigger more overdrafts. If you made 5 purchases in a day, for example, of $5, $10, $15, $20, and $100, banks would often process the $100 charge first, followed by the others, ensuring your account went negative sooner and stayed negative longer. This practice was so widespread and profitable that it sparked a wave of lawsuits. Law firm Tyco and Zavary alone negotiated over 15 settlements, ranging from $2 million to $137.5 million, recovering more than $370 million for customers who were illegally charged. Wells Fargo paid $203 million, Bank of America $410 million, and TD Bank $62 million for these deceptive practices. The industry's defense reveals their priorities. When regulators proposed reforms, banks did not argue that fees were fair or necessary. They warned that reducing overdraft revenue would force them to eliminate free checking accounts and reduce services. In other words, they had built their entire business model around these controversial charges, using them to subsidize other operations while marketing those services as free. Consumer advocates saw this coming. Chi-Chi Wu from the National Consumer Law Center remembers lobbying federal regulators in the early 2000s, warning that banks would expand overdraft fees from checks to debit cards once they realized the profit potential. That's exactly what happened, she says. It is all about the fees. It is all about how much money they could make on overdrafts, and they make billions on overdrafts. The tide began turning in 2010 when new regulations required banks to get explicit customer consent before charging overdraft fees on ATM and debit card transactions. Studies found more than half of people who overdrew their accounts did not even remember opting into these services. That suggested banks had been automatically enrolling customers without clear consent. Reform efforts accelerated in recent years. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, established after the 2008 financial crisis, began scrutinizing overdraft practices more closely. Some banks started eliminating fees entirely. Ally Bank became the first major institution to do so in 2021, followed by Citigroup and Capital One. In December 2024, the CFPB finalized a rule capping overdraft fees at $5 for large banks, potentially saving consumers billions annually. CFPB Director Rohit Chopra argued that rather than competing on quality service and attractive interest rates, many banks have become hooked on overdraft fees to feed their profit model. But the banking industry fought back hard. On the same day the rule was finalized, banking groups filed lawsuits challenging it. When Donald Trump returned to office in 2025, he immediately removed Chopra and installed a pro-industry director. Within months, Congress passed a resolution repealing the overdraft rule entirely, and Trump signed it into law in May 2025. The repeal ensured that banks could continue charging unlimited overdraft fees, and some institutions have already reported increases. JP Morgan saw its overdraft revenue rise 7.66% in the first 3 quarters of 2025, collecting $815 million. Industry representatives attribute this to economic pressure on consumers, suggesting that inflation and financial stress are driving more Americans into overdraft situations. Yet some progress continues at the state level. New York has proposed regulations eliminating the most exploitative practices, and enforcement actions persist. There is still room for change. The CFPB recently fined Navy Federal Credit Union $95 million for illegal surprise overdraft fees, noting that the credit union extracted nearly twice as much in overdraft fees per account as Wells Fargo, and more than 3 times as much as Chase. That enforcement action signaled continued scrutiny, but it did not reverse the larger trend. Today, American consumers still pay an estimated $20.3 billion annually in various bank fees, with overdrafts representing the largest single category. Over the past 2 decades, overdraft fees alone have cost consumers approximately $280 billion, a figure that dwarfs the bailout money banks received during the 2008 financial crisis. The overdraft fee system represents one of the most successful profit schemes in modern banking history. What began as an occasional courtesy for bounced checks became a sophisticated revenue machine that generates billions by charging the highest fees to the most vulnerable customers. Despite reforms and public outcry, the fundamental system remains intact, continuing to extract massive profits from Americans who can least afford to pay them. The next time you see a free checking advertisement, remember that someone is paying for that service, and it's probably not who you'd expect.